Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about the Russian coal industry. Now, you're probably thinking, coal, hang on a minute, you're really digging down into the bottom of the barrel here, aren't you, Joe? Why are you talking about coal? Nobody uses coal anymore. Well, I think you might be surprised at how much coal is actually being consumed globally at the moment. If we have a quick look at this chart, this shows the amount of coal being consumed in the USA. You can see that from 2008 onwards, there was a significant downward trend here. However, that trend arrested in 2021. As we came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a huge demand for everything, particularly power. And at times when there's a surge in demand for power, the best source of power is coal because you can fire it up at will. If you're looking at renewable energy like solar or wind, then you want just constant demand. But if you suddenly have a huge surge in demand, then coal is still the best option. And you can see that in 2021, usage in the USA went up and it stayed at a high level in 2022. We saw demand coming down in 23 and 24, but in 2025, it's actually gone back up again. It went up by 8%. And if we look at the global picture, the current demand for coal is at an all-time high. It's at 8.8 billion tons. And you can see a very clear trend here that's going upwards. Now, coal has been around in Russia since 1721, so over 300 years. And it has some of the biggest coal deposits in the world. It's one of the world's biggest exporters of coal. So you would imagine, given the level of demand, that things should be going really well in the Russian coal industry, but they're actually going really badly. 74% of the industry is reported to be loss making. In 2025, over 20 different concerns, including some mines, had to be mothballed and closed down. And they're now talking about the whole industry being on the verge of bankruptcy. And this isn't because we're seeing falling coal prices. So we haven't got a situation where there's rising demand but falling prices. This chart shows the movement in the price of coal over the past 12 months. And as you can see, it's been a bit up and down, but broadly speaking, it's been relatively stable. If we expand the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that actually there have been some really big profitable moments here. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, coal prices went through the roof. And that was as a result of a global increase in demand for coal at a time when there wasn't enough supply. So that was actually a hugely profitable period for any country that was exporting coal. Now, things have calmed down a bit over the past couple of years, but you can see that the current prices are above the long term average. So Russia should be doing really well at the moment. It should actually be making a lot of profit. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, because of the sanctions, their whole industry has now been completely undermined. Excuse the pun there for mind, just in case you didn't get it. Because coal is bulky and it's heavy. So it's difficult to transport. It's not like oil. If we compare oil and coal, a ton of coal sells for, roughly speaking, around $100. A ton of oil sells for around 5 times that amount. So it's 5 times more valuable. But in terms of actually transporting it, oil is much easier to transport because it's dense. It's a liquid. You can take it out of the ground and then put it onto tankers, fill those tankers to the brim, and then they sail away with their highly valuable cargo. When we're talking about coal, it's bulky, it's dirty, and actually a piece of coal is aerated. So when you pick up a piece of coal and compare it to a piece of concrete, for example, obviously the weight is vastly different. Concrete is a dense substance that is very heavy. Coal is full of air. So when you burn it, obviously some of that air is released. But that isn't great when you're looking to transport it. And you can't just crush it down into powder because nobody wants it then. So you have to leave it in its block form. And this is a real problem from Russia's point of view because before the war in Ukraine started, it was exporting huge volumes of coal to Europe because that was the easiest place to actually get it to deliver it to. And it could move a lot of that coal on the railway system and on the roads. But now that the sanctions are in place, Europe has turned its back on the Russian coal industry. And so its two biggest buyers are now China and India. And obviously, transporting large volumes of coal becomes less attractive for the buyers. And so Russia has had to offer large discounts to both India and China to encourage them to take bigger and bigger volumes. If you have a look at this chart, it shows the countries that produce the most coal. You can see that China is right at the top of this list, producing over 50% of the global supply. In the last 12 months, it produced just under 5 billion tonnes of coal. India is the second largest producer. It produces over a billion tonnes, that's around 12% of the global production. Indonesia comes in at number 3 with 9%. The United States, number 4 with 6%. Australia is just ahead of Russia, producing around 460 million tonnes. Russia produces around 430 million. And then we've got South Africa, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Colombia. But in terms of who's actually using the most coal, you can see that China is also at the top of this list. It's actually consuming more than it's producing, so it's a net importer, only slightly, by around 200 million tonnes. India is the world's second largest consumer, consuming over 2 billion. So it's one of the largest importers of coal because it's got a bigger differential between what it's producing and what it's consuming. The USA is a net exporter, but it's consuming 400 million tonnes of coal still. It's quite a big number. Japan comes in at number 4 with 180 million, followed by Indonesia. Russia is number 6 on this list. It consumes 150 million tonnes, but obviously it's producing over 400 million tonnes, so it's got a massive surplus to export. And then we've got South Africa, South Korea, Vietnam, and Germany on this list. So when you look at the market fundamentals, Russia should be doing quite well because they're a net exporter. They've got lots of coal that they can sell all around the globe. But because of the fundamental issue with coal, it's bulky and it's not that high value. So you don't really want to be transporting it thousands of miles. It's not the same as oil. Russia isn't seeing the same level of demand for its coal as it's seen for its oil. But India has actually been buying coal directly from Russia, but it wants a huge discount to offset all of those transport costs because you can't send coal to India on the railway network. Russia is able to move some coal to China using that method, but China, like Russia, is a huge country as well, so it doesn't really want to transport all of its coal that it's importing on the railway network. And also, one of the problems that both Russia and China have with regards to those railway network is that there's a lot of demand for that volume because if you're putting tons and tons and tons of coal onto the rail network, then that's taking up all of that capacity, which could be used for higher value products. So within Russia, we're seeing the coal industry being displaced by other industries that can offer a higher return for the rail network to use. So this is one of the fundamental problems that Russia is facing. But also, some of the Russian coal companies have been hit with direct sanctions. So there's now a risk if you're continuing to deal with them that you yourself will get hit with sanctions. So that's a big issue now for both China and India. And as a result of all of these issues, it's been reported that in 2025, the Russian coal industry reported a total loss of 350 billion rubles, which is more than 3 times the loss of 112 billion in 2024. But we've got year on year losses here. And this is now why some of these companies are being closed down and why some of the mines are actually being shuttered. So what does this mean for the Russian economy as a whole? How big and how important is Russian coal? Well, it employs around about 150,000 people directly, and then indirectly, there's another 50 to 75,000 people who have jobs that are related to things linked to coal. So we're talking about maybe 250,000 people in total in Russia who are dependent on the coal industry. So their jobs are now potentially at risk because Russia is losing its position as one of the world's largest exporters because coal isn't really a substance that you want to be exporting over vast distances. It doesn't really work in the same way as oil does. Now, one of the problems that Russia has is that a lot of this employment is concentrated because obviously, if you're employed in the coal industry, you'll be close to those coal mines. So, in the regions where they're heavily dependent on coal, these regions are now facing economic hardship because people aren't getting paid, there's less jobs going around, and as we've talked about before, that creates a negative multiplier effect. So, the positive multiplier is that if you pay me $10, I go down to the store, I spend that $10, the store makes $10 of profit, it pays its employees, those employees go out and spend money in their stores, and so it goes on. So for every dollar that you pay me, it should have a multiplier effect of 3 or 4 times for your economy. But the reverse also applies. If I lose my job and I don't have $10 to spend, then I'm not spending it in the store. The store doesn't get paid the money. It then worries about paying its staff. Maybe the store has to close. And so you can get a negative multiplier of maybe 2 or 3 times whatever the job losses relate to. So in these regions that are dependent on coal, they are starting to see their economies imploding. And that's a big problem from Russia's point of view, because Russia geographically is absolutely huge and it's got all of these different regions spread across. And so the Kremlin is going to have to pick up the pieces. It's going to have to start supporting these people, offering them some sort of social welfare, helping out these regions at a time when it really doesn't have enough money because of the continued investment into the war in Ukraine and the falling level of revenue from oil and gas and now coal. Russia is seeing its balance of trade getting way out of kilter, so it can't afford to keep spending on the war unless it carries on selling all of its assets. So we know that the National Wealth Fund has been depleted. It's now selling gold, which is at an all time high in terms of price. So it's a good time to sell. But over the long term, that is going to really damage the long term viability of the Russian economy because you can't keep dipping into the family wealth chest because at some point the wealth chest will run dry. So, the overall summary of today's video is that what we are seeing in the Russian coal industry is the long term damage to a long established industry that's been around for over 300 years. Russia's been one of the world's exporters of coal for a very long time. But we're seeing the long term implication of the sanctions really now starting to undermine this whole industry. Russia is seeing it collapsing because you can't keep pulling coal out of the ground if you don't have anybody to buy it. It's not a high margin product. It's not the same as oil where you're making a lot of profit. The profit margins are relatively low. It's bulky, it's difficult to transport, it's difficult to store because you need huge areas to store all of this coal once you've actually extracted it. And what Russia has seen is that the demand for its coal has fallen because its closest neighbors, who are its biggest buyers historically, have turned their back on the market. They don't want Russian coal. So all of that nice network that Russia had built up, where it could move lots of this coal through railway systems all across Europe, across the land, they've all become redundant. And Russia has had to depend on India and China, the two biggest buyers in the world. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, there just isn't the profit margin. So 75% of the industry is now making losses. Those losses are increasing every single week. So we're seeing more and more companies coming under pressure, more and more closures. There is a risk of multiple bankruptcies in 2026. And we could see the collapse of this entire industry in Russia if this situation continues. If the war in Ukraine carries on indefinitely, then at some point Russia will have to close more and more of these mines. And then it becomes a question as to whether or not it's economically viable to keep a very small industry going. But there is a lot of demand for coal, particularly within Russia. And so it may find itself in a situation where it's just supplying its own internal demand. But unfortunately, from the industry's point of view, the majority of its profit comes from its export markets. And those export markets have been completely decimated as a result of the financial sanctions. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention. It's just another issue that Russia is having to deal with. Something like coal, I'm sure most of us don't even think about because it seemed to be something from the past that maybe your grandparents used to buy coal and use coal, but nobody does these days. It's all about electricity. But as we've seen from the data, a lot of countries are still using coal to produce electricity, even though it's quite a dirty way of doing it from the environment's point of view. It's very efficient in terms of creating a lot of electricity in a short space of time when you've got surges in demand. So most countries still depend on it for peak periods of demand. And so we've seen that increasing over the past few years. It's estimated that it will start to go down over the next 5 to 10 years. But because of the large demand in China and India, global demand remains high. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, India and China are starting to lose appetite for Russian coal, and that could spell the death knell for the Russian coal industry. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already.